Hi there.
Nice entrance. That was beautiful.
Yeah? Yeah, sorry about that. The postman just called, and I'm the only one in our house who can open the door to him. So.
Well, thanks for taking some time. Really good to meet
Oh,
you.
pleasure.
Is that a real background or a Zoom background?
No, it's real. That's 20% of my Starbucks mug collection.
I had one of those before I became a nomad and I let them go, but it wasn't quite that
Uh,
impressive.
now, they go around the other two walls. So every city I go to, which has one, I collect.
That's awesome.
And it's interesting, somebody bought me one for a city I hadn't been to, and they're still offended because I didn't want it. I just said, take it back. I can't have it. All right. It's wrong for me to possess this item.
I didn't earn it.
Uh, no, yeah, you can't see the floor though. This is the tidy bit of the study.
Yeah.
But the floor is piled high with books and that I've got to read and papers I haven't dealt with and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking some time to chat. I've been been following your work and a fan of your work for a long time since I was introduced to it. And we're in this freaking crazy time right now. I think
Yeah.
it's more relevant probably than ever, and I imagine you're really busy. So
Yeah. 19 and 18-hour days the last 2 days.
yeah, crazy. So
Yeah, but there are advantages to being stubborn. I've
eventually.
said for years I've refused to compromise with systems thinking, and finally it's paying off. So.
So let's start there. Talk a little bit about because I know you've talked about systems thinking versus kind of more complexity and being
Mm.
emergent. And how do you see those two things as different?
I think there's a couple of critical differences which we need to make. So one is complex adaptive systems deals with systems which have no linear material causality. Whereas most of the cybernetics-based systems thinking, although it has multiple connections, assumes there's causality within those connections. So if you have a system which is non-causal in any meaningful use of that word, you can measure dispositional states, but you can't determine outcome. And if you look at all of the popular systems thinking approaches over the last 20, 30 years, learning organization and they start by defining where you want to go and try and resolve it by setting a goal. Complexity says what matters is to describe the present and identify which pathways forward are coherent. And that opens up to possibilities. So that's one key distinction. The other within complexity we're making is between human systems and systems otherwise in nature. So the whole modeling approach, agent-based modeling, which a lot of people associate with complexity, has a huge amount of value. But because human beings have intentionality, they have intelligence, they have multiple identities, they're different, and we need this transdisciplinary fusion of cognitive neuroscience, complexity, anthropology, philosophy, and that's where we work.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Now I'm getting a lot of questions from business owners. They daily emails, calls, like, what do I do next? Or what do I do now? And it's the first time in my career of 35 years where I can't just say, do this.
No, we're actually doing that. We're having fun. So I'm writing a big handbook on this at the moment with the EU policy labs, right? So we're saying there's some basic things you do. First of all, is you manage the constraints. You need to understand what constraints you can manage. Yeah, forget everything else, and then you need to start to work on those. Secondly, you need to create learning now, because the learning during the crisis is critical. And with UNDP, we actually we launched provisionally yesterday, and we will launch fully on Monday, a Leaders Journal of Learning and Innovation. So leaders can actually keep a record of that as the crisis evolves, and that can be distributed across the company. The second thing is you've never had a better chance to innovate. So finding practices which people are adopting in a crisis, which actually have utility, and finding ways to take those forward are valuable. And as I say, I'm writing this handbook on how to do this with the EU policy labs, which will hopefully be out next week. And the next thing you have to do is to set up an unintended consequences team. Because the one thing you know with absolute certainty in a crisis is whatever you do will have unintended consequences. So you need to model them, and you also need to react to them. Because a lot of the unintended consequences will be beneficial if you've got the sense to see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the final thing we're telling people to do is monitor for outliers, which is literally whole of workforce engagement in sense making, and find the people in that workforce who are thinking differently about the problem.
And then what do? Bring them into a team and give them some...
No, it's a mixture. So, I mean, for example, we're about to do a big map on ethical attitudes to triage, because triage decisions at the moment are being made which are going to cause downstream trauma for medical staff, and they're quite scary. So that's going out to a huge number of people, so we can show the different dispositional states of people from different backgrounds. Now, those maps will show some people who are thinking very differently about the problem, so we need to go and talk with them. And that's also true within organizations. So if you can get the whole of your workforce doing what's called micro-situational analysis and micro-scenario planning, then you've actually got cognitive, cultural, experiential diversity in your primary sense making, so you won't miss weak signals. And remember, our stuff originally came from DARPA work on counterterrorism. And the point about weak signal detection is after the event, you all know what you should have seen, but at the time you don't. So the techniques were developed to make this visible.
Yeah, and the space that I work in, a lot of high-tech virtual reality, emerging technology, which by itself, there's a lot of weak signals because it's evolving so rapidly. And then you put it in this environment, and it's really hard to make sense of it.
And you can scan, I mean, this is for more peaceful times, but we've done work, for example, using science fiction writers, coupled with ethnographers. And then we built game environments in which managers are actually think they're in a science fiction environment, but actually they're not, they're in their own company. And because of that disconnect, they think about solutions they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, you can still do that in a crisis. So using metaphor and heuristics and habits can often be more effective management techniques than dealing with problems directly. And the way I always explain that to people is just, everybody's got teenagers or at some stage in their lives. You never manage teenage problems directly, you always manage them indirectly. And that's a 101 complexity rule. Always approach a complex problem with multiple tangential indirect probes and see what's possible. If you take the problem on head on, life is not going to be fun.
So you talk about rules versus heuristics, and so for a business owner who's looking to kind of create a culture that could thrive in this environment, like what do they, you've just given some tips on that, but as far as creating the heuristics to give people a framework to work within, any tips there?
Okay, so let me be very specific on that, all right? There's a basic rule in the complexity, is that you centralize coordination, but you distribute decision-making. And the problem is the natural crisis response is to centralize decision-making. And that won't work because you'll just get information overload. Yeah? But you've got to trust it when you distribute decisions. So there are two approaches to that, one of which is not available if you haven't done it in advance. So heuristics are normally derived from the stories of people during crises. And then they're codified and then built in with teaching stories. So that's something we've done with quite a few companies. The famous example of this is the US Marines. If the battlefield plan breaks down, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. And the point about the heuristics is they're empirically measurable, they're not qualitative. And that's really critical. If you haven't done that, then you do different types of distributions. So for example, we're doing trios and nested trios. So you basically say, guys, you've got to make this triage decision, right? If a nurse with 10 years experience who you've never worked with before signs it off, you can make any decision. You see what I'm doing? I'm just forcing people to pay attention. I might put 3 people into that. If the decision has massive consequences, I might put 3 teams of 3. And we're developing work we were doing on alternatives to jury trial for this. There's a problem with the jury, 12 good men and true, to go back to the original phrase, is one person dominates it. There's the famous American film on that, and then there's the Hancock's half-hour total satire of it. Yeah. But the basic fact is one person can dominate. So instead, what you actually have is 4 juries of 3. They work independently of each other, and if 3 out of the 4 agree. So it's the same sort of process. So there are things you can do very quickly as a leader now, which don't require a huge amount of energy, and which actually give you that confidence in distributed decision-making.
Mm. Yeah. So, so to take it back up a level for people who aren't familiar with
Mm.
the Cynefin framework, are we, you talk about complicated, complex, chaos. Where are we between chaos and complex right now, would you say?
We're kind of like on the boundary between complexity and chaos, and we keep dipping into it. Yeah. So kind of like the first stage, you have to decide. And this is what we talk about is assess, adapt, accept, transcend. You've got 4 stages to go through. So first, is this a contingency we planned for? If it is, go into contingency planning. If it isn't, then you're into an initiation of radical change. Yeah. And that means you can't afford to use existing instruments. You've got to create novel ones, and you get into this managed constraints, managed learning, all that sort of stuff, right? Once you've started to get stability, that's when you get into what's called the XAP phase, or radical repurposing. So feathers, which evolve in dinosaurs for sexual display, get repurposed for flight. The human cerebellum, which evolved for muscle manipulation, gets repurposed for grammar. When somebody notices the significance of a Hershey bar melting in their pocket, we get microwave ovens. So you've got those sort of sequencing. So what you start to do is to radically repurpose existing capability against the current crisis. You haven't got time to invent from scratch. And that means, high abstraction association. There's all sorts of tools and techniques for this. And once you do that, you can start to see a way forward, and then you can transcend the crisis. The key thing is to transcend the crisis, not return to normal.
Yeah, great advice. We're in an industry where it's literally been shut down and gone to zero, and it's going to be a long time before traffic patterns could return to normal, if they do, whether whatever that means. And so repurposing core competency. So one thing I tell companies to do is look at their core competency, look at their talent, and how might they apply that in other areas. What are the other things people should be looking for in that repurposing?
I think one of the key things is to match existing capability against unarticulated needs. And that requires high abstraction mapping, right? Yeah. So that's key thing. The other thing is distributed sensing. There are people in your organization who have seen things you can do, and they're being filtered out before they get to senior management. And we call that finding the 17%. So that's a reference to a famous set of experiments in which radiologists were shown a batch of x-rays. On the final x-ray, a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, was put in plain view. They were asked to spot anomalies, and 83% didn't see the gorilla. And the 17% who did came to believe they were wrong when they talked with the 83%. So from a senior executive position, you need to be pulsing or scanning your community every few days to identify the 17%, because somebody out there is spotting things.
Yeah. We've all seen examples of that. I've been on both sides of it too. When I did my first layoff in business, I had people come to me and they're like, and I did the exit interviews, and I was like, why didn't you tell me these things before? And they're like, we figured you knew. And I was just like,
yeah. I think the other thing, trust becomes, there's one value of a crisis. You can very quickly work out who you can trust. So we've been putting together a whole bunch of COVID type offerings, and everybody's throwing their life into this. All right. It's critical, spending 18 hours a day. But there's a few people on our network who are listening and then creating their own things to go and sell independently of the network, and they're taking but not giving. You really need to take a crisis as an opportunity to find out which of your staff you should really be working with, because the political players are a nightmare. And I remember, this is completely indirect, but I was working with one of the big companies on merger and acquisition. And the CEO said to me, what's the first thing you should do? And I said, everybody you've currently got on the list as good managers for the future, because they'd identified the people they thought were on board. I said, I guarantee you 80% of those should be fired. And he said, why? I said, because the really good guys are actually getting the job done. these guys are positioning themselves to make themselves look good to you. And I remember Jan looked at me and said, shit. And he went away and did it. And he said, came back and said, it's 90%, it's not 80%. So I think people reveal themselves through action, not through presentation.
Yeah.
And it's been one of the other problems with systems thinking is with the obsession with, common values, common beliefs. The trouble is, if you write your values down, you just lost them. Because now everybody will use that language, so you won't know who's genuine, who isn't. And we have a key phrase on this. You need to manage for coherent heterogeneity. Homogeneity is everything is the same.
Gotcha.
And if you look at it with the agile movement, with systems thinking, they got obsessed with homogeneity. We have to have a common belief, a common value, a common set of goals. That's totally bloody disastrous because you lack variety in the system, so the system lacks resilience. What you want is heterogeneity, difference, but it's got to be coherent. And the way I normally explain that is I could be standing here in a Cardiff Blues rugby jersey, right? I'm Welsh, which means opera and rugby are two critical aspects of my life. And we sing at rugby matches, we don't chant. Now, Cardiff Blues are a really professional team with people of high integrity who play brilliant rugby. But then we suffer from these bloody idiots down in Llanelli who bribe referees, foul at pack, all right? I mean, we hate the bastards until the English arrive and then we're all Welsh. Right, so that's coherent heterogeneity. We got differences, but we don't have differences in different contexts. And organizations need to manage for that. The other key thing on that is you define direction by what you don't want to be, not what you do want to be. It's very easy to get consensus around where we don't want to go. It's almost impossible about where we do. And if you think about it, all the fairy stories we tell our children are not stories about how Dick and Jane stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, attended the daily stand-up and achieved the family KPIs. They're basically about Dick and Jane going into the woods and doing things they shouldn't have done. We have a happy ending because we want them to sleep. But the reality is we learn through failure, and all of our storytelling traditions are about teaching children what to avoid, not what to do. And that's a lesson for organizations. You can pull out of a crisis if you decide where you don't want to be, but that leaves options open for exploration and it engages staff better.
That's a great idea. That's great advice. Now, one of the things that you recommend and I subscribe to, in a complex environment is you have to be emergent and you have to have a bit, you have to take the come. Can you describe, I recently thought everybody knew what that word meant and realized that they don't. And I'd love to hear in your words, like, how do you describe emergent?
I can't like stopping using it because it's become a bit trite. People say, oh, it's emergent as an excuse not to show discipline. So I think there are three things you can manage in a complex adaptive system. You can manage the constraints, and constraints aren't all negative. I mean, we did some work with the Goldratt theory of constraints guys last year. There's a big difference between, for example, enabling constraints and governing constraints. So enabling constraints connect things in such a way that the energy gradient of change is lower. And if you don't have constraints, evolution doesn't happen. No? Right. So, constraints can be permeable, they can be non-permeable, they can be elastic. There's also a concept we've been working with, constraints can be dark. That's a reference to dark energy in cosmology. You can see the impact of something, but you can't see what's causing it. So that's your map number one. You can then change the constraints, try and impose constraints, make a fixed constraint permeable, see what happens. That's what you do as a manager. Catalysts are intelligent probes. You do small things that you can recover from quickly, safe to fail probes, because they may not succeed or fail. They're not there to succeed or fail. They're there to allow you to map the dispositional landscape so you can see what's possible. If you get a beneficial pattern as a result of the catalysts, then you put energy at it. So it's a very simple process as a senior manager: constraint maps, catalysts, energy allocation, and you coordinate that in the center. Yeah, and then life is actually a lot easier than it is in this highly structured engineering metaphor, which has underpinned the last 3 to 4 decades.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, this actually. I used to teach leadership with Peter Drucker, which was a privilege, right?
Yeah.
And it actually came after he totally beat me up because I attacked Taylorism on stage just before he spoke. And I got the equivalent of that famous vice presidential debate with the I knew, it was that, all right? So I was a puddle of humiliation on the floor. This 93-year-old genius has taken me apart. But he decided I was retrievable and took me out for dinner. And then we ran some workshops together, which was, saved me in IBM. IBM had never had anybody doing stuff with Drucker. But one of the things we agreed on is that scientific management and complexity theory have more in common with each other than either does with systems thinking. Because both accepted automation, but they remained a place for human judgment and apprentice models of management learning. Systems thinking has progressively tried to remove judgment from the equation completely with black box AI, rigid processes, structured spreadsheets. And I think that we need to recognize that the capacity for judgment has been radically reduced in organizations the past 3 or 4 decades.
What's your thought about AI in general?
Firstly, what matters, AI, I've worked in it most of my life. What matters is the training data sets. And we've already seen that in published cases. And part of the problem is a bunch of the training data sets and the algorithms are written by sort of white males on the West Coast who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which is kind of like really scary, right? So the training data sets are more important than the algorithms, and the training data sets are heavily culturally biased. Secondly, they tend to rely on text. And the problem is we can write down about 5 to 10% of what we know. When we're doing the lessons learned capture at the moment, we're capturing voice and pictures as well as text because it's richer, particularly in narrative form. So I think it's not an either or, it's a both and. But one of the reasons we do a lot of work on training data sets is if executives understand where the system was trained for, they're more likely to accept it. If they just get a black box, it's more problematic. So I think that's one aspect of that. And then I think there's what I will call the evil end of AI, which I think is actually wrong, but if they were right, they were wrong morally, right? Which says that correlation equals causation. And that's give me enough data and I can tell you exactly what's happened. That's the sort of quasi-deterministic end. And I basically think that's wrong, right? And the other problem is AI people don't report their false positives. They only tend to report their positives. So I think it needs to augment human intelligence, not replace it. And I think we need control of the training data sets. It is kind of like critical.
So last question I have is you referenced Dan Hill's Medium post where he talked about the COVID-19 crisis being an A/B test on our way of life. What's your thinking about that? I'm curious why you referenced it.
And I said we did a big podcast on complexity and COVID the other day. One of the things I said in it, which I may learn to regret, is that COVID was God's gift to humanity. Because it's kind of like, so I'm a Catholic, right? So this is kind of like it's a purgatory period, but you've got a chance of redemption. Because what we got is something, well, I think it will probably cull about 10% of the world's population. If you look at both direct and secondary effects over the next 2 years. And it will cause an economic meltdown. In fact, we're now at the point where we realize that money actually doesn't matter. That's actually quite significant. All this, there isn't enough money for this. Well, sorry, there is, right? So I think that gives us a chance to get our act together as a species, right? And I think there's a willingness to do that, which I haven't seen before, because global warming is going to be far more catastrophic than this. And the next pandemic might have a 6-week gestation period and take 80%. Coronavirus already has 16 variants within the last 6 months. And it's mutating fast. So I think it's a chance to get our act together.
Yeah, that's great. Man, thanks so much for taking the time. I think these are
a real pleasure.
And I guess your trip to Melbourne next month has been canceled.
Not doing that. I'm waiting to see on November. My problem is that even if November's opened up on the States, I have to be careful because my wife has a set of chronic immune diseases. So if she gets it, it's not good news. So I don't think we're going to be out of this for months yet.
Yeah, that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand is a number of people that are young that have comorbidity risk, right? There's my son's got diabetes, 21, 25. And so
chemicals in the environment have reduced resilience. Children, I mean, I was at CDC in Atlanta a few years back, and one of the things which came up in a think tank was, well, kind of like in a real pandemic, people under 40 might go because they haven't had the childhood diseases. So, you know, my generation, we had scarlet fever, German measles, mumps, we had the whole bloody thing, right?
Yeah.
And we're pretty real. And also, we got mucky and we played with people in the street, whoever they were. So the resilience factor in society is a problem, and the destruction of the natural habitat has weakened wildlife. So the disease vector transfer is higher.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm still optimistic, but it's a season. Lincoln famously said something. It's my favorite thing from Lincoln. All right. I think otherwise was problematic because he, you know, didn't really want to end slavery. It was just a way of ending the Civil War. But he said, as the times are anew, we must think anew, we must act anew. And the combination is key. We've got to think differently as well as acting differently.
Yeah. How's the online thing going?
That's interesting. We did our first online training course, and I wrote afterwards and said, we're not doing this again. I said the lecture content has to be in 50-minute chunks and handled asynchronously. And the synchronous stuff has to be all conversation. So we're doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't get feedback. And I was lecturing, I've got no idea whether people are getting it or not.
Yeah.
And it's part of the stress issue with Zoom, because you're seeing people's picture, but you're not picking up the unconscious chemical things that you get in an audience. So your ability to respond goes down.
I did a presentation last night at a conference called Evolve Virtual, and it was almost in a bad video game where it was an avatar and I was controlling an avatar.
Oh,
I got no feedback from the audience. It was a terrible, as a speaker, it was a terrible experience.
I know, it just drives me insane. I mean, I normally turn up with about 50 slides and then decide which slides I'm using after the first 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And I know the minute I see the audience, within about 2 seconds, I've got it, right? But I just don't get that virtually.
Yeah, it's terrible. So we'll figure it out. Dave, I really appreciate it. Someday, I'd like to buy you a cup of Starbucks coffee in a mug you purchase yourself.
Thanks.
And I, you know, stay safe, stay sane, and I'll keep following your work.
And you, yeah. Cheers, man.
All right,
Bye.
take care. Bye.